Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody's able to hear me this morning. If you can make a quick indication that you can actually hear my audio, that would be absolutely fantastic. Okay, thank you for taking the opportunity to join us this morning on our InnoFactor webinar for Azure Foundation and Governance. It's my pleasure to take the next hour of your time. My name is Damien Flynn. I'm a consultant with the InnoFactor team based out of Norway, and I'm focused on Azure and Azure-based technologies. I'm quite new to the opportunity of consulting, with my history essentially having been based in enterprise, both in the manufacturing and in the services and localization for over 30 years, hosting many roles, responsible for services from networking to global operations, integrations with DevOps, and cloud optimization services and private cloud. I have had the opportunity to contribute to a number of different books on cloud technologies over the years, and I'm proud to be a Microsoft MVP since 2011, focused on private cloud technologies, both on-premise and most recently with Azure. And I'm also lucky enough to be recognized by Cisco as a champion focusing on their networking technologies and software-defined services. In this morning's webinar, we're going to spend a little bit of time and talk about Azure and some of the challenges that we have to deal with as we embrace this fantastic platform. Like all environments, we have the opportunity to start in greenfield or to be currently in a brown scenario, essentially where we already have a lot of technologies in place and trying to improve our posture and how we deal with this. Regardless of the situation that you may find yourself in, either brand new to the concept of going to Azure or very mature in going to Azure, we all share one set of challenges, and that is, how do we actually make better use of cloud technologies? How do we embrace the services cloud offer us? And how do we use that to evolve our organizations without the additional stress of trying to re-educate a lot of the support teams that are involved in this operation, while also, of course, mitigating risk and controlling costs. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about the risks and realities of moving towards a public cloud service, some of the blockers and some of the challenges that we're going to run into as we try to actually get ourselves into a governed or controlled scenario. We're also going to spend some time talking about what is governance and compliance and what does that really mean in this world? How do we approach this, and what do we get as a benefit of taking this step? Then we're going to talk about something that I think is absolutely imperative, regardless of how you do cloud or what cloud platform you use, and that is the concept of cloud native governance. I'll explain what that means and why we care so much about that. Then, of course, finally, we're going to take the opportunity of explaining how we do this, because there's all good and well highlighting the problems that we're probably all acutely aware of or have certainly started to understand may possibly be challenges. But more importantly, we need an approach. How are we going to actually deal with this? And I'm going to outline how we in InnoFactor address this with you and help you to work your way through in short time to become a platform that is built and sustainable for governance now and towards the future. If you have questions at any point, there is a Q&A session built into the webinar, so please feel free to post your questions. I'll keep an eye on that on my second screen and hopefully try and respond as much as I possibly can to your questions. I'll take a little time near the end to offer you the opportunity as well to ask more questions and dig in more. And at that point, I think we should be good to actually get into the meat of this. So before we do anything, I think the very first thing we're going to do is actually spend a little bit of time and set the scene. So I'm going to introduce you to some characters just to help us picture some of the challenges that we are going to face as we move into the world of governance. Now, I'm sure all of you have come across Harry Potter. Harry obviously was a young lad with magic abilities, but like everybody else, time is not on his favor, and of course, he indeed is getting a little bit older. Now, that meant that his revenue for making movies has obviously started to decrease and has a requirement to figure out how he's going to make some better income. And one of the most pivotal weapons in his arsenal is that of the magic wand. So our friend has had this fantastic idea of, well, let's sell these things because lots and lots of people are very interested. So he goes ahead and sets up for his first time ever this thing on Azure called a web shop, and starts essentially establishing a presence and getting things up and running. And before long, we're actually off to a pretty good start. He's selling his wands, some potions, some capes, and like every other organization that moves to the cloud, Harry is starting to smile and he can see things happening in a good way. So, with a little bit of excitement and after a small bit of a learning curve, he's sitting down with his friends one evening, and those happen to be the Seven Dwarfs. The Seven Dwarfs, we all know, are not the youngest people on the planet at this point, and carrying pickaxes is probably not the very best thing for their backs. So Harry starts explaining to them that there's better ways of making money. So these guys are, well, of course, interested in paying the bills as well. So they decide, you know what, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to set up a web shop, but this time we'll focus on a lot more of our merchandise. We have a pretty big brand name here that we can actually leverage. So without too much hassle, Harry shows them a few tricks and tips from the web shop he's established, and off these guys go establishing their own web shop. And of course, like all good things, it's pretty fast to pick up. The brand is very strong, and before we know it, these guys are actually starting to sell quite a lot of content. Now, this is not unusual. This is very similar to the concepts that you having your first steps into the cloud, putting your first teams up on the cloud, and then as they start to embrace the level of success and satisfaction, they of course are eager to share and work with their other counterparts within your organization. Hopefully, also all reaping the same benefits. But everything doesn't stay rosy for too long. And as Harry sits down and takes a look at what's happening, he notices that in the most recent week, there's been a serious drop on orders for his wands and his merchandise. They're quite curious. He's not really sure what's going on. So he takes a little bit of a look in the back end and realizes that there's a little bit of a challenge in his cloud configuration, because where he is today, both himself and his friends, the dwarfs, they're all sitting inside the same subscription. They effectively are using his area in the cloud to effectively run their own environment. And well, things weren't set up very securely because we didn't really have a lot more skill other than understanding how to scaffold up our own web servers. So it didn't take long for the dwarfs to make a bit of a mess and break Harry's servers. So knowing what was wrong, quickly was able to re-establish his services, restart his servers, and of course sales immediately picked up again for another few weeks. Things were so successful, actually, Harry decided he's going to scale his operations, bringing in lots more different types of wands, and, well, stuff breaks again. And of course, this time it doesn't take him too long to start figuring out those dwarfs. They're being at it again. So we will have to think about those for a few moments. And reality is that the history of the dwarfs is that these guys are miners. That's where they've come from. They're not computer nerds. They are certainly not cloud architects, and they have a focus on what they know best, which is mining. And in this particular case, they also have had the bright brainwave of, well, let's do some data mining for Bitcoins. And of course, if they've got access to something like Harry Potter's subscription, then running a web server is probably not returning them the investment they want. But Bitcoin mining, of course, may give them a whole lot more. And before long, Harry realizes that these guys have gone in, deleted all of his web services, and started deploying coin miners across the whole of his subscription, giving quite a large bill at the end of the day for systems that probably have got GPU accelerators and on. So this pretty much drives it straight home to Harry that we have a problem. We need to go back and take a much closer look at how we build our cloud. And we need some level of segregation in our cloud so that what I do for my product and my services isn't going to be affected by what the dwarfs are trying to do to make their life better. Let that be selling clothes in a shop or reusing the cloud as a big mine for data coins. With that in mind, Harry then looks at his governance, figures out that this is the way we're going to move forward, and can then reestablish himself with a much larger web shop and a larger presence, and everybody can live happy in the cloud. Now, it's a far-fetched story, but it's not that far-fetched. The reality here is that we have just sat down and looked at what is probably common in a lot of organizations that are new to the cloud. They have this concept of we can get up there, we can put our services up, we can then start scaling that service out. But we do a lot of this without putting together the practices that are required to help us continuously monitor, audit the environment that we're running, defining some guidelines and policies, and working at the processes. And probably more importantly, how do we actually set the coordination and guidelines between these different groups? Do we need to? Because in reality, the dwarfs weren't talking to Harry after that first encounter to get their web server up and running. And the same is probably very true in your organization. You're going to have one team that effectively is the lead on taking clouds. They've been there first, they've tested stuff out, and they're going to be the reference team that helps everybody else get up. But it doesn't take a huge amount of time for those guys to essentially put their feet under themselves and start becoming their own rulers of cloud services. And as a result of that, we have left in a scenario that we need to deal with the management of the activities that are going to go on in that cloud. This is really what we're going to start focusing in on, coordinating the resources and the actions to make sure that they are in compliance with everything that we need to do in our organization. So for example, we talked about the fact that our friends, the dwarfs, decided to do some data mining. Well, we've probably got a scenario sitting back that that's not acceptable. We really don't want that happening. And probably more importantly, these guys decided that they were going to delete all of Harry's virtual machines. That's not really acceptable either, certainly in an organization that somebody can go in there and either maliciously or accidentally, which is probably more likely, deleted those virtual machines that somebody else was leveraging. And of course, then there's the other scenario. These guys decided that in order to make money, we need lots and lots of these. And cloud scale makes that really easy to do. But is it appropriate for me to put virtual machines or resources that belong in the cloud into different regions of the world? Let's just think about some of the data that we might have had up there. You may make a business decision saying pretty quickly that as organizations that are based and hosted out of Europe, we really don't need to have services running in Asia or in South America. And given the fact that Microsoft have now over 50 data centers, it's not that difficult to choose those destinations. So as a business, and as we start building our services to the cloud, we either look at this up front or we look at this in retrospect. Now, the challenge becomes, of course, how we actually implement our services and how we control this. So there is a circle of life, just like there is for pretty much everything else we do in our day jobs. And in the world of cloud, that circle of life is around securing the threats that we may have as we put our resources up there, protecting from outages and accidental deletions, monitoring to make sure we're aware of outages. For example, I'm not sure how many of you guys are aware, but Microsoft suffered an outage on Azure in the Northern Europe data center for a period of about 4 hours just 2 evenings ago, Monday evening, due to power failures, and that had an adverse effect on a subset of customers across pretty much all of the resources. Now, if we're monitoring for some of this stuff, or we're deploying our infrastructure so that it is highly available, then these type of outages may not be of any relevance to us. So depending on how you actually implemented your Azure environment and the stuff that you're hosting in North of Europe, you may have been completely unaware of the fact that there was an outage. This is sort of stuff that we need to make sure that we're in place for compliance and we understand the best practices. We also need to be able to organize the stuff that we're dealing with, making sure that we understand our subscriptions, minimize sprawl for those subscriptions, and of course, probably most importantly, have control over everything that sits there. Then we've got this concept of automation, where we want to essentially govern, control, service restrict, put policies in place, and just make sure that we have a full handle on everything that's happening in our environment. So that's quite a lot of different things that we need to focus on at the same time. And if our job right now is trying to understand how we're going to leverage and move our friends, our business departments, our employees to use the cloud, then we're probably going to be very busy doing it first to have an idea of what it is that we're doing and what we're going to advise these guys to, because as the gatekeepers to the cloud, somebody needs to be able to answer the question. And if I'm really busy learning this stuff, then I really don't have a lot of time left to actually address any of these things. And this is really when that evil begins, because ultimately, because I haven't had time to sit down and plan up front, then ultimately something's going to catch up with me and potentially pass me out. And that may be the one thing that costs me the most in the long term. Now, what that cost is, of course, is the risk of unknown. We don't know if that cost is a security breach, a financial cost, or simply time and efforts that's going to be needed because we engineered incorrectly, or whatever the case may be. But there are many different costs we need to deal with. Now, of course, some organizations take the exact opposite approach. Some organizations decide that we have a much easier way of controlling these things. And that is, they introduce the idea of a central cloud engineering team. Now, these guys become the custodians of our cloud. These are the asset managers, or what we would like to call shadow IT or central IT for the cloud area. It depends on your organization and its maturity. There's different terms and stuff being introduced. But the reality here is that if you want to use the cloud, these are the team you need to work for. Now, that's all good and well. And depending on the posture of that team, this may be a very successful recipe. However, the reality in many organizations is the posture for this particular team is that they are the team that was originally part of on-premise IT. And as a result of that, their abilities are focused very strongly on the knowledge that they've gained for how to do networking, how to build infrastructure, and how to run services in a non-cloud scenario. But they now become the gatekeepers to what happens in the cloud. And as a result of that, they also become the blocking point, because they will make some decisions stating what type of services that you're actually allowed to leverage in the cloud. That's not something we want to do. If we're going to leverage the cloud, we want to make sure that we can take advantage of the stuff that's going to save us the most money and give us the highest return on investment. The other challenge that we have is that, like everything else in the cloud, and as we've just seen with Harry and the dwarfs, we have this problem of sprawl. Just like we did with virtual machines way back in the early 2000s when we started putting these things out, we have VMs all over the place once they actually started taking off. It's very similar to see things happen like this in the cloud. And certainly in Azure, you may have many subscriptions, or you may have many different resources, but what are those resources doing? Who owns them? How much are they costing? Do I still require them? Can I consolidate? There are many questions that land on us here. And reality is that this problem may actually be a larger issue than what we've seen originally in the world of virtual machines. And on top of this, the concept of containerization. We're seeing lots and lots of organizations now move from the concept of a virtual machine to the portability of a container. Containers are designed not to be deployed in single instances, but to be deployed in minimums of twos and much larger numbers. That sprawl gets quite large quite quickly if we don't have an approach how to deal with this. And that also ends up in a scenario that we're hosting those containers on some cloud technology, either on-premise with tooling like Kubernetes, or hosted up in our Azure with the Azure Kubernetes services. But in either case, we still have some challenges here. How do I identify? How do I control? How do I understand what these are going to cost? Now, the good news is that the governance that we build to help us deal with controlling our cloud, again, regardless if it's Azure or AWS or Google Cloud or any of the other partners, to be honest, or if we're looking at container-based technologies, most likely managed through orchestrators like Kubernetes, then a lot of the stuff that we're about to look at is very similar, because a lot of the practices are common to both of these type approaches. So how do we look? Well, we look like a typical deck of cards with a lot of stuff sitting there. I've got my resources sitting in a big pile, and I don't really have an idea of how it's organized. And some of the challenges I need to deal with is, well, it's all good and well. I know that they're sitting there, but how am I going to deal with these things? Because I can't effectively start restructuring this whole world. I've got my business already sitting in the cloud. So it's all good and well, Damien. You're sitting here on behalf of InnoFactor today telling us that you can actually sort out our problem and make us a lot better. But we're making money, we're running our business, and I cannot afford to have any disruptions to it. I need to make sure that the services that I have are highly available and that we can continue to scale the way we are. I really don't have the scale either to start assigning you lots of people to come back and re-audit my environment, write governance, and start to figure out how to put all these policies. So we have a number of challenges here that are going to block this thing, or at least that's the perception. So what I'm going to try and do over the next number of decks is essentially address some of those concepts and acknowledge the fact that what we're about to do needs to be done in flight. And that's one of the beauties we have in the cloud, because in flight in the cloud gives us a number of different posture approaches, which is simply not possible in your data center. In your data center, you are working with a finite resource. That resource, if you need to expand it, means I need to make a capital expense. In the cloud, we are working with an infinite resource. That's controlled only by the total cost at the end of the day. But by managing what we're doing, taking a close look at what needs to happen, we can expand with risk and cost sitting straight in mind and effectively restructure ourselves with a nice, simple approach. And we can do that as aggressively or as passively as we think is appropriate for our business. And we can also put a lot of the governance services around the infrastructure that already exists. And the benefit of doing that is it gives us visibility into where we stand in compliance. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So first off, why are we here? We're here about cloud governance and cloud management. This is a cross-functional responsibility within your organization, and it has to be dedicated across a complete team. So like DevOps, there is no such thing as a DevOps role or a DevOps person. It is a team, it's an operation, it is a grouping, it's an ethos. Governance is very similar. The key point here on governance, however, is that this needs to span not just the IT and not just the development, but this has all of your stakeholders. Your finance people, your human resources people, your operations people. Every person in your organization has now got a vested interest in this governance. Why? Because we may be talking about data leaks, we may be talking about cost control, we may be talking about service availability, we may be talking about product launch. There are so many different facets that is effectively run by the business, because essentially we have to remember at the end of the day, IT is here to service the business, not the business to service IT. And that's something that gets reversed from time to time. So in this particular case, the Council of Governing for your cloud will need to have representation from each of these different stakeholders of the business. They can help us make some of the decisions. So we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that Harry and the dwarfs were putting resources all over the world, and maybe it wasn't appropriate to put stuff in Asia. Well, then what happens if we're sitting at that decision-making process for where would I like to have my cloud resources? IT will quickly come back and say, well, from security posture or from resourcing posture, we're going to put the stuff in Europe because that's where our customer base is. However, we may not be aware of any of the intricacies that the business is operating on and the possibilities that they're about to make a new acquisition. So for example, maybe we don't have the inside knowledge to know that we're about to acquire a set of resources in maybe India or in Asia, in which case our governance should state that we are authorized to deploy resources in the European region and in this additional region. And that's only insight that's available to us as we go through governance if we invite the rest of the business in here. Now, of course, I acknowledge that we're going to be sitting here talking about technical stuff in order to build a governance for a technical platform. And that's something that we're going to have to deal with as we work through this whole process. But that is part of the design of how we actually implement this. So the very first thing we're going to do is sit back and take a look at those resources, figure out that what we have in that big pile and organize it a little piece. Now, by organizing it a little piece, it allows us to put some structure around what's sitting there. Now, this is all metadata. So in essence, we're not really doing a lot other than sitting down here and identifying. So we're not breaking anything that sits in the environment. We're just building a level of identity around what's happening in the environment so that we can figure out what are the applications, what parts of the organization are these affecting, and allow us then to continue building up additional metadata around what is happening with these different types of resources. Now that metadata immediately allows me then to do things like classifications, allows me to look at who's responsible for costs, what are our security postures, what are our risk postures, and all of these different things. So in quick short time, we can quickly take a look across that whole platform of resources, and it may be a very extensive list, or it might be quite short list, but we will have a level of identification of what we have in that environment and allow us to figure forward how do we structure these. Now, the reality is that information is already in your organizations. The problem is it's not centrally located, or generally not centrally located. So we have to spend a little bit of time just fixing that up so that it is centrally located. And we will talk about where that location is and how that works in a few moments. We then take that a step further and we talk a little bit about the policies. We've hit upon the policy a few times now at this point about where should I put my resources. Now that's just one of many, many different types of policies. But more importantly, after we define a policy and we write a governance documentation, how do I actually know that somebody's reading that documentation? It's not sitting in a drawer, gathering lost in dust and forgotten about, and probably not even updated. So we do go ahead and we acquire in our Asia. And then a few weeks later, we go ahead and we actually acquire in North America and then follow that up with more acquisitions. Who's updating the policy document? Are we being compliant? Are we not being compliant? How does that actually evolve into a real living, breathing thing? This is the differentiators that we need to be very clear on. And again, at the same time, we need to be very clear that we are not trying to make even more work because we are already stressed, we are fully loaded, doing everything we can do, and we had all of those challenges up front that do not break what we have today, Damien. We have to make money. So all of this stuff needs to happen in tandem. With finite resources, that's certainly going to be a big challenge. So how are we going to approach some of those things? Now, once we do a lot of this stuff, we get to a point then where we can actually do some validation, because ultimately, if we have a policy, that policy should be vettable. And from that point forward, I can then take a quick look to see, okay, meets policy, breaches policy. And then I can sit down and have some proper talking about, okay, so the scope of work that I need to do is considerably smaller than I originally anticipated. Now I actually have a finite measure of what the scope of work is. I can start planning mitigations. I can start also scheduling to say that this is an urgent, or this is stuff that I'll do after Christmas in 2019. I don't need to worry about this yet because the risk levels associated to it are really low. So I'm introducing yet another concept as part of governance, and that is the concept of risk, the likelihood of that risk occurring, what are the consequences of that risk happening, and those then will drive us down to the point of prioritization. How fast do I need to deal with this issue? So as we continue going through this, we're ending up introducing the concept of a blueprint. The blueprint effectively is now what allows us to start figuring out as we start moving forward. We originally opened up with the concept that Harry was the first guy to put his stuff up in the cloud. He built his blueprint. He was so happy with it over 3 weeks. He went straight over to his friends, the dwarfs, and then handed them the blueprint and said, this is what you need to do build a website. Build your shop and go have fun. Now, where we failed on that is that we didn't figure out how to put the governing behind it. And the reality is that is where pretty much most organizations are today in Azure. They really don't have the governing to make sure that we stay within the confines of that blueprint. I'm going to show you how we do that as we move forward. Then you end up with a solution that allows us to start putting boundaries around these things so that we have that ability to ensure things like role-based access. I'm going to make sure that Damien has not got the privileges to actually go to both Harry or to the dwarfs and delete their resources. Unless, of course, that is my role in the organization. And if it's my role, then of course I will have that privilege, but it all depends on who I am and what my job is at this point. It also means that I can put boundaries to make sure the dwarfs and Harry don't start standing on top of each other as well. And of course, then we may actually have central IT who are responsible for certain resources like maybe identity or networking and communications. So these guys may actually have resources that we want to share between both Harry and the dwarfs and ensure that when they use the services, they're using them based on the compliance and the knowledge that the networking team have instantiated in the environment and are built on the best practices. It's these blueprints that allow us to effectively start establishing forward. And this is really the first piece of work that happens after we have figured out everything that sits in our environment, how our environment works. Now let's take a quick look at what we really should have done up front and see how close we are to being compliant with that original design. Do we need to make tweaks, and can we do those tweaks with little risk? So the mitigation task that's necessary. From there, we're left with one more piece, and this really is where things start putting icing on the cake, because in many organizations we have this challenge that the cloud is something that is responsible of the cloud custodians, that cloud IT team. And as a result of being owned by the cloud IT team, I guess it's that team that also gets the bill from Microsoft at the end of the month. And it's also that team that sits in front of their friends, the CFO, from the finance perspective, every year looking for more budgets. But the reality here is that the consumption that the IT team are using in the cloud is probably absolutely minuscule. They may have some shared services for storage and for networking, as we talked about, but the reality is that the resources that are really being consumed are by Harry or by the dwarfs or by some other department or operation within your organization. And this is where we need to start turning around and giving some information back. So we hand this back with the concept of cost reporting. Show back is another term that we may have used regularly. So depending on the maturity of your organization, you may of course be in a scenario where right now every resource that's used in the cloud needs to be pre-vetted, pre-validated, and associated with the project, which means that effectively then you are charging that project for the resource. But in many organizations, that isn't the case. In many organizations, we're in the exact opposite side. We're building the resources for them. We're warning them, don't use big stuff that's going to cost us lots of money. But that's kind of where our governance dried off. So we've gone through really yearly the process of tagging and identifying all of these resources, figuring out the metadata. So I know the who, I know the what, I know the application. I have a lot of context now to every one of these resources. So because I have that context, I can now actually report saying, well, actually, you've got 6 pieces of infrastructure sitting in Azure, and together for the last month, that piece of infrastructure cost me €100 or €1,000 or €10,000, depending on the resources you're leveraging. I can report that information back to you in a very simple spreadsheet or a very quick email so that you have an idea of, well, you've just spent that amount of money last month. Now, more importantly, I've been telling you what resources you're doing, so I'm giving you the insight to start controlling your costs. Now, that cost may continue to expand, and that's absolutely appropriate if you're getting a return on your investment. However, I also now have a tool to hand this over to the finance guy so that as I'm getting ready for my next year's budgeting process, I can clearly state that, look, I understand that we have a lot of costs sitting in running the cloud. Infrastructure is costing you 1/5 of the total cost, but the rest of your projects are costing you this. So from a budgeting perspective, focus on my stuff. And then when you need to deal with the other teams, then you have the data to go there. So without redesigning your organization, without any level of effort, you've actually got to a point where you can start sharing an awful lot more information that previously was just not possible because we effectively are just doing simple things like tagging and identifying our resources. And then it leaves us with the very last piece of the puzzle. You've handed off the costings. Now who's responsible for usage optimization? Up to now, it's always been the IT guy, basically looking at the virtual machine and telling you that, well, I've given you this big machine because you told me you need it. And of course, you are banking on the fact that I needed enough processing power to make sure that my code, which is extremely well written, performs very well. But the reality is you're using about 15% of the actual CPU services that are available. So I could co-host you with others. Now, let's turn that coin around. I've just shown you the costs. You've cost me 10,000 a month. You're getting a little bit of pressure now from the CFO, who's now responsible for optimizing it, now becomes that project team, the owners of the service. They now may have an incentive to sit back and say, well, I think I might actually not need that amount of resources. I might be able to actually scale back a little bit. So the focus is moving slightly out of the IT world and much more into the actual people that are living in the cloud. And again, without any level of effort. We haven't had to do a lot other than insert a little bit of pressure. And again, we're not drawing boundaries here, so there's nothing stopping us from working together to reduce our usage or optimize our usage or focus our services. So together, this is where our knowledge and where our policies and our governance and our circle of life begins, because now we can sit together and figure out that, lads, I have actually come up with this brand new architecture that says, instead of running our websites on a virtual machine, we can use something in Azure called a web service. And then somebody else comes back and says, yes, but your website doesn't actually change. The pages on those things are pretty static. The marketing guy fills them in, he posts them up to the web, and nothing really happens with it until the next day that we actually update the page. Well, if that's the case, then I don't actually need a web server. I don't need to pay the investment on a computer servicing out pages. Instead, I can put those pages onto a blob of storage, which costs me maybe 10 cents for a month, and I hide that behind a content delivery network, which means I get acceleration of that web page across all of the regions that I care about. And that costs me maybe €1 a month. So now I'm running a website at global scale using cloud technologies for an absolute fraction of the way I was running it before. So I can optimize without actually compromising, and I can also optimize with the concept of scaling. Now, none of this would have been possible before because I really didn't have that vision. But now, because I've got governance and I've got policy and I've got procedure and I've got metadata, I can turn around and say, well, this actually might apply to all of the other guys as well. So we can share that knowledge and work through the ability of making everybody else also validate and leverage this effort that we're about to make. And that means ultimately we get to save money. So there we go. That's the concepts. Now, the benefits of doing this. Well, there are many more benefits to do this, and we'll think about a few of those. So very first off the top of the bat is the concept of automation. We can now sit back and release some of that effort that we have locked up in resources minding the environment by sharing the load so that we can essentially automate. We can make sure that stuff that needs to be happen, for example, communicating how much that resources cost to each of our different teams. It's easy to know who those teams are because they have to establish a resource group. We can put an alias against the resource group, and therefore any resources that are tagged with that same product ID or resource group or project number, we can automate the process of figuring out what the bill cost and sending them an email. That's the first step of it. There are many, many things we can automate here, but even for the day-to-day processes of mundane financials and not specifically technical stuff, it's an easy win. We also then get to a point where we can start looking at the opportunity of using the cloud to do what it was put there for in the first place. Save me the efforts of managing a data center. Save me the efforts of taking care of all of that sophisticated stuff to ensure that networking is working right. Yes, of course, we're not washing our hands. We still have network skills that we need to do. We're infrastructure skills or patching skills if you're deploying services still in the concepts of infrastructure, so virtual machines in the cloud, but we now have the ability to sit back and innovate, leverage the stuff that's in the cloud to make our lives easier, and ultimately do what we want to do, reduce that cost. We talked a little bit about the optimization a few moments ago. We can take that capacity that sits in the cloud, we can come up with alternative and different types of infrastructure, and this is where governance and cloud really starts to stride. Because regardless of what we do as an engagement to get governance off, that might be a 6-week engagement or whatever period of time it's involved, but we're not done. We shouldn't be done. This should be a service. We continue to work with you guys, and the reason behind that is very simple. The cloud doesn't stand still. And as we look here, there is consistent optimization going on. There are new types of storage. There are new types of services. There are new types of everything being brought out every 6 weeks to the cloud. And there are 150 types of services right now in Azure, each of those running on a 6-week cadence. And of course, they are all not running on the same cadence, which means that this week we're going to get 20 new services, next week another 20 services from a different set of teams, and so on. Now, those services may be of no value to me, or those services might be exactly what I was waiting for. Somebody needs to sit in there and start watching what's happening. And that becomes part of the architecture role within your organization, where these guys start to get vision. But it also becomes part of the responsibilities of a partner like InnoFactor to help show you the new services, identify some of the problems, some of the benefits, and try and make some decisions on what might be good for your organization to make you forward. A very simple example. Microsoft recently introduced storage accounts and updated from version 1 to version 2. Now, of course, your first gut reaction is, well, if they've brought out a version 2, at some point in time, they're going to take version 1 and they're going to shut it down. So from this point forward, I'm going to make a governance decision that, well, everything that gets deployed from now forward shall be deployed to a version 2 type storage. Simple enough, pretty logical, and probably the reaction of most organizations. But as a partner, I would be sitting here telling you, please do not do that. We need to first make a decision on what type of services you're running on top of that structure. If that structure of service is using a requirement for high IOPS for read and write, then I would potentially turn around to you and say, yes, makes sense. This is faster services. You will get a benefit for sure. If, however, you don't really care too much and you're running that static website, then I would certainly say do not change to version 2. Now, why? Well, the why, that's part of that offering that we sit down, and that's part of that governance. That's part of that insight that we get as being advisors with Microsoft on the Azure product, by being MVPs and by being very close to Microsoft. The why is because we understand that you are no longer paying for storage the same way as you did. You now pay for storage based on IOPS. So in a version 2 scenario, if I was paying for that storage that I suggested would maybe cost you 10 cents for your website for that month, in a version 2 scenario, if your website happens to be a busy website, we're going to be paying for every time we read or write a block of that storage. It isn't an absolute far stretch to say that my 10 cent a month now becomes €50 a month simply because we have changed the billing mechanism. Now, that's something we don't want to get caught with. And that's where the governance can come into play, when we make a policy saying, if your workload is type A and B, let's stick where we are on type 1. If your workload is the type that necessarily calls for performance, then our policy is that you move to type 2 and you pay for that performance. This is how we optimize our workloads together. And then, of course, we have the capital and operational expenses, because this is really where we get to make some big changes in how we go back with our friends in finance and stop talking about the fact that we need to make large investments in our data center, and we can move a lot of these expenses to the day-to-day costs of managing and running the services, and we can then start spreading that cost, so we can get to a point where we're comfortable to make some decisions about handing over to our friends in the dwarfs or in Harry Potter world to say, look, there's the cloud, go forward, do what it is you need to do to be successful. And I'm not going to have a cold night dreaming about the fact that these guys are trying to delete everybody else's resources and put out Bitcoin miners all over the place. That scenario now needs to disappear, and governance allows that. And the other benefit here is that if you do move your organization to a governance scenario, history has shown at this point that there's a potential of 20% higher profits, because you have a structure, you have released a lot of the controls and allowed more of your organization to drive forward in a very clear methodology. So, what does that really mean? And how are we going to do all of this? We're going to introduce you to the concepts, and I started this earlier on, of cloud native governance. We're going to open up the concepts that we're not going to actually put some other third-party software sitting in front of your cloud. We're not going to write all of the rules of engagement in this third-party software to say that you can only use these particular resources, that you can only put them in these types of regions, you must select A, B, and C. Because there's a few problems with that approach. Well, the first problem obviously is you need to buy. So now I've got an investment again. Now, it might be a cloud or it might be on premise, so depending on capital or operational expenses. It might be a scenario that I have to actually then think about the tooling. I've got to think about the training because this is a brand new tool. So everybody's going to leverage this. The operations teams, the developers, they now need to look at this tool, use it to interact with the cloud, and then have it update the resources sits in the cloud. Now, there's another challenge there then. For example, what happens on this concept of that new storage that Microsoft introduced? If I'm using a third-party tool, I'm going to have to wait for them to give me a new update so that it's aware of the new version of the storage. And then I need to write the policies against it, and you get the drive. This is just a never-ending circle that is giving me nothing more than pain, cost, challenges. I don't need it. Nobody needs it. And then I'm not going to tell you that all of your toolings for pipelining and for Visual Studio and for command lines, they're all broken too. Oh, and you're not also allowed to log into the Azure portal directly, because if you do, you're bypassing this governance thing. Yeah, we're not going there. We don't want to go there. That's just a bad plan. We're going to go cloud native. And what I mean by cloud native is we're going to continue doing stuff the way we done. I'm going to give them full access to Azure. I'm going to give them the Azure CLI, the Azure PowerShell, the Azure portal, the Visual Studio integration, the REST APIs, whatever it is that your teams are being using to work with Azure and they have already become accustomed to or about to start learning, it is going to be native Azure. That's how we're going to do this. So that way we can at least embrace the fact that there's lots of documentation, lots of support, lots of ecosystem, lots of consultants, lots of internal knowledge that does not need to be dumped and rebuilt. And we can then talk about the IT custodian and figure out what his role fits into this picture and how it works. So what are we doing and how are we doing this? We're going to introduce the concept of policy-based management. Governance is all about rising risk. It's about addressing that risk and understanding what is the likelihood, what's the consequence, how do we mitigate? That drives a policy. So the risk is I'm going to put stuff in Korea. A policy is we won't be allowed to put stuff in Korea. The compliance is we check to see if it's in Korea. The mitigation and the consequences for that happening is taking a look at stuff that we've already installed in that cloud and figure out, oh, it's in Korea. What am I going to do about that? And depending on the workload, you may sit back at the likelihood or the consequence and say, it's not important, we'll deal with it later, or, oh my God, let's get that sorted today. Priority one. Those are the simple things we can now act on. And getting to that point of acting is a real fast accelerator. It doesn't take us months upon months to get there. It takes us a matter of days to write the policies, run the compliance reports, and get that visualization. We can then take the mitigation process and run that at your own timeline. We then also start the benefits of all of the rest of this lifetime. Visibility into what we've got in our environment, the management and costs controls, and ultimately, we're going to go to this very end one, the governance of subscriptions. We're going to hand off the keys just as we have previously, but this time I'm going to introduce the concept of guardrails. We're going to put the concepts in place that the policy is going to be the guardrail to help me ensure that what I blueprint and deploy is going to fit within my governance. So we'll run this in tandem. We will write the governance the old-fashioned way in a good old document. We'll maintain it and support it, but and really importantly here, that will have an enforcement policy telling us how we actually are going to manage this and a compliance feedback to tell us that we actually are doing a really good job from the get-go or as we move forward from this point on. Now, how we deal with this is also important for the concept of DevOps. It's also important from the concepts of innovation. We sat back and said one of the benefits of using the cloud is we're innovative. One of the drawbacks of using the cloud is the fact that we've got custodian IT. Custodian IT have made a decision saying, I am not letting anybody do IoT. I'm not letting anybody do Cosmos DB, and I am not going to do any of the following things. Why? Because I've got nobody who knows how to monitor them, nobody who knows how to support them, nobody in the team that's got the time nor the effort to deal with this stuff. So if you're going to use the cloud, you're going to use virtual machines, websites, virtual firewall, that's it. Nothing else. That nails the benefit of the cloud in the coffin, in the head. Might as well give up and go home. because now I'm not going to save a whole lot of money. I'm not going to move from an infrastructure type solution to a platform or to a SaaS type offering, because we now have a problem, and that breaks everything that we've been talking about. And that's why we're going to go cloud native, and that's why we're going to do a policy-based guardrails on approach. We are going to turn around and tell our developers, do be innovative. Go try these things out. Figure out, can you run our website on a blob of storage with a CDN and not need any other type of virtual machines or web services to run this thing? And if you do, can you leverage a function which is going to cost me, well, absolutely nothing if I run it up to 1 million times in a month? It costs me absolutely nothing. So yes, of course, please try that too, because now we're going to move from running a website at €100 a month to essentially €1 a month. I'm all in game for that. And what does that mean for monitoring and support? Well, guys, if you're going to try and figure out how to run the services, then I suggest you also run the process of making sure it's highly available. And that's easy because the cloud is a tick box to say distribute it, and make sure it's monitored. And again, that's easy because the cloud has all of the monitoring tools that are necessary for each one of these things. So we make it the roles and responsibilities for that dev team and the operations team together to figure out what is the right way for doing this. How are they going to architect to the future and give them that ability by giving them the subscriptions to say, go ahead, do everything what you want. But again, I'm putting those policies in place to say, not allowed to put it outside Europe. So the building blocks of this is how we start off with this concept. We're going to give them a subscription, and one of the very first things we do in a compliance is that credentials are going to get vaulted. We're not going to tell you the username and passwords to get into our shared services. We will give you access to a vault where you can request the keys to that shared service in an audited way. But if I need, from a security posture, to update the passwords or change certificates or whatever the case may be, then I can do that through secure key management. We'll also need to introduce the identity, federate and use roles. Again, a lot of the simple building blocks that we already have in place, we're just basically going to insist that moving forward, this is the only way things are going to work. You're going to use this identity and we're going to leverage the roles that exist. Central IT are responsible ultimately for your data centers, for your communication. They also will be the team that are responsible for building proper networking communications, peerings, tunnels, and all of those type of connections, both to your customers and to your back on-premise services, if you have those still. That responsibility becomes part of what we call the shared services for IT. And that building block is ultimately what becomes a scaffold for allowing everybody else in the environment to communicate. So the rules of ingress and egress, traffic flowing into or out of the cloud, if you basically make a decision saying that I want this filtered, then we continue that. We continue that governance. We also make sure that everything that we build sits in that world of making sure that we have logging. They're all centrally logged. So we build these subscriptions with the guide rails in place. So here's a brand new subscription. That subscription has been granted access to the vault, being wired up to the networks. That might be the network for development or for production, depending on the state that you're in, and pre-configured with all of the bells and whistles needed to make sure logging and security is turned on, and piping it to the correct location. Again, this is really easy to scaffold. We use Terraformation scripts and Azure blueprints essentially to build these subscriptions online and get them in place for you so that you can then just move forward, hand off the keys and say, go ahead. And we can also turn around and say, because this is just for your developers, let's put a credit limit on it, saying from the finance team, go ahead, put all of the governance restrictions in to make sure they can only run it in one place, but also put a financial limit on. Allow them €100 worth of resources in the month. After that, then cap it, it's done, no more. And from that perspective, that innovative piece now becomes into play. So shared services is really the piece that the central IT team now need to move back into. They need to focus on that networking piece of the world, the domain services for authentication or for supporting the original services you may have had on premise, moving those up into the cloud, making sure name resolutions. This is not skills that you need to continue running if you're going to be running platform or SaaS type solutions. But if you are going to deploy infrastructure-based services, then These shared services is what your central IT team are going to run. Bastion hosts so that you have jump boxes to get in and out of environments. And most importantly, of course, images. Just as you do today on premise, if you continue to do infrastructure-based services in the cloud, there is no reason why not to continue using images and manage your own marketplace as you move forward. So all of these pieces become part of your governance and approach to move forward and how you're going to build that framework for monitoring, for escalation, and for support, because ultimately IT are going to become some sort of a gatekeeper to your support mechanisms. We're just going to make sure that everybody else, as they get involved, follow through on this same process. And in order for us to maintain this, we go back and look at everything we can and will automate. So I bring in that new subscription, I will automate its provisioning. I will look at the fact that I've got a billing system, I will automate that bill. Anything that needs to be done. I look at the fact that you've got virtual machines sitting in the development environment. If it's after 5 o'clock in the evening, automate the process to shut them down. Automate the process to bring them back on at 7:30 in the morning so that when the users come back in, they're back online and running. That's going to save me 18 hours worth of CPU runtime. So I'm immediately getting benefits doing these things. And I don't need to nag people to say, did you or did you not? And we can, of course, then use things like metadata, a tag in essence, to say, don't shut this machine down. It's running critical Bitcoin mining, as the case may be. So we can put all sorts of smarts into these automations for exceptions and whatever policies we need to place. And then, of course, the last piece of this puzzle, we need to make sure that we have that restricted access so that we can control who does what where. We have no more challenges with poor Harry losing his website because our friends, the dwarfs, decided that they were going to scale their operation into Bitcoin mining. So Sandboxes is really where we're going to start with. Give the ability for everybody to learn and experiment. No longer panic about the concepts of they're going to put the wrong stuff out, the expensive stuff out. We use our guide rails, our policies, our governance to control that. We put the limits in place to make sure that we are not worried about what's happening in that environment, that we're giving as much ability to these users as we potentially can. And then we take that a step further and we also introduce sandboxes for the team. So not just individual learning. That's good, gets them certified, gets them completely in here and gets them to be subject matter experts. But also let's repeat that same type process. Give them the building blocks, the same building blocks that we would put up into Azure for running their particular services, so that they can actually try that service and take a look at it. And we're not going to be dealing with, well, it ran in our environment, we've handed it over to the IT guys and the IT guys have failed. Forget that stuff. That's dead. What we're going to do now is we're going to give them a shared service, let them work together, figure out how it works way before they need to get operations involved. And more importantly, get operations involved right now at this phase of it, so that we go from here straight through to production. So from team innovation, we move into staging, quality, production. This process will introduce their DevOps without actually having to do any work. And as I stated before, governance isn't a single person's responsibility, and neither is DevOps. These are shared responsibilities across the organization. So the life cycle then becomes very clear. We have a very defined life cycle that we can move from development, and all that we care about here is that the networking that we have scaffolded as a shared service is just going to be bound up to the development network, which might mean that the network team have a set of restrictions on where the traffic can come from or go to. We give them permissive access to do what they want in that environment, tweak it, fix it up, make sure that their deployments are working correctly, but we scaffold it with all of the governance, all the building blocks as it would be in a production type environment. We move that towards staging. Nothing changes much, except we now insist that if you're going to put stuff out here, you can't deploy unless you're using an automatic deployment system. We restrict your access to ensure that, and we wire you up to the staging type networks, again, depending on how your environment works. But these then put that forces in place to make sure that we're just putting some of the additional policies of governance into situ so that you know what it feels like to move from development into staging. And then it doesn't take a lot to figure out that the final step in the process is that production is a fully automated solution, because production, let's be respectable here, is the same as staging. It's just a different target, and we are ultimately limiting the access to who gets in here as a break glass, to the point that we probably won't even break glass. We'll simply roll back production because we're using pipelines now to deploy our software. We've started that process without actually having to put a huge amount of emphasis on these teams to make it happen. So in essence, What we are talking about is the goals of building an automation, making our environment scalable, having some self-service to make sure this works, put the guardrails in place, make sure everything stays flexible, and we can audit everything that happens in their environment. Governance with the InnoFactor solution is based on a very simple approach. We sit together, we look at what we need to do from the policies perspective. So we walk you through with your council of the different pieces of information. We build that policy document, including tagging strategies, naming strategies, automation, scaffoldings for how you're going to build your environments, and from there start putting together your shared services if they need to be remediated, and then define the policies. So over a portion of a few weeks, we'll write your documentation, we'll guide you through all of the pieces. So if I ask you what are your risks that you want to deal with, if you don't know what those are, I'll bring you a set of common risks. We'll vet those. We'll then figure out if they have a likelihood or a consequence in your environment, and we'll write policies against that. You'll end up then with a full governance solution. We'll build policy so that we can implement that against your environment, and that policy will then of course hand you back compliance. That way we can have a good look to see how we look at it in our environment and what mitigations are necessary. And then we continue that life cycle as we move forward with a never iterative loop of basically coming back, checking to see what new services you've been using, what new policies have changed, what new infrastructure has been introduced by Microsoft, and move forward leveraging more cloud native technologies. The how we physically implement this, if you're interested in understanding that a lot more, then please reach out to one of the sales team or respond to the invitations or the feedback that's going to come after this particular presentation, and let the team know that you want to know a little bit more about how we actually do this. How painful is this process? And believe me, I've gone through this with a number of customers. It's not painful. You don't need to have a lot of experience on governance. You don't need a huge investment in time. We'll guide you through that process. We'll build you the scaffolding, we'll build you the policies, and we'll get you to a governed scenario as fast as we possibly can. And we'll continue that journey then as we pass lots of new services that happen in Azure and in your environment. Thank you very much for your time. My name is Damien Flynn, and this has been an absolute pleasure to go through our governance solution with you. I do invite you to ask any questions in the Q&A sessions if you have any additional questions. And of course, please follow up with the team afterwards and let us know your feedback. And of course, if you have an interest in understanding more about how we implement governance in the Lumigate /InnoFactor services. Thank you.